Okay, so welcome from Flanders, welcome from Ypres. I'm on the southern sector of the Ypres salient, and as you can see, I'm in the trenches. We're broadcasting direct from the old front line, and what's more appropriate than being in an actual trench itself. And I'm here at Bayernwald, Bavarian Wood, Croonaert Wood on many of the British trench maps. And this is now a set of reconstructed trenches from the First World War, which gives us a good kind of insight into an early war German trench system. And there are some original features. So we're looking down a stretch of German trench here. And while this is a rebuilt trench, they use the original methodology, the original materials and tools to give us quite a good kind of insight into these trenches. So if we look at the duck boards, it looks as if they've taken the easy option here and just laid kind of flat sections of timber down on the floor here. But actually, this is the style of the Bavarian units that occupied this part of the front. And back in 2012, when we worked with Simon Verdigam down at Messines, he found very similar trenches with very similar duck boarding. And underneath that is a drainage channel, which helps to drain away some of the water, the problem that you get here in the wet Flanders plain. And so there's a lot of people suddenly joining, so bear with me. So this is original. This kind of flat planking that we see here is original. And this, you know, what we probably in Britain call a kind of wattle and daub style trench support, revetment on the side of the trench, is also very, very typical of the Bavarian unit trenches that were dug on this sector of the Messines Ridge. So it gives us quite a good insight. And again, when Simon Verdigam was working at Messines, he found trenches with this kind of trench support in them. And when he had the timber like this analysed, he discovered that it wasn't timber. Even the flooring was not timber brought from Germany. It was timber that had been brought from the Belgian Ardennes forests. So the Germans were looting occupied ground to help build these trenches. Whereas if it was a British trench, they'd be calling on the resources of empire. And this kind of timber probably would be from Canada, because they were chopping down the very high quality Canadian hard timber trees and using that to construct trenches and dugouts and tunnels on the British side of no man's land, which was over there. We're kind of looking up over the parapet now. So this is a rebuilt system of trenches, again, using that original methodology and all that kind of stuff. But it gives us a really good insight. We're going to walk through it in a minute. But before we get there, I'm just going to come back slightly, because while the trenches are rebuilt, there are some original features in here, which includes this German bunker, which is from probably from about 1916. So this was not obviously an original bunker built when the Germans first occupied this wood. And one of the units that came here in the very beginning was the 16th Reserve Bavarian Infantry Regiment, which included Adolf Hitler. So there is a podcast episode about this, about Bayernwald, Croonaert Wood, where we are. And this wood is a place where Hitler came to in that early period of the First World War. But the bunker wasn't here then, because this is later defensive technology. So the interesting thing is, when I first came to this wood in 1982 on my first trip to Ypres, this was a trench museum. The bulk of the museum was over there in a bit of what is now a bit of private woodland. But this bunker and another one was part of the wider kind of trench system here. And the owner, Andre Becker, was a bit of a character. So he had a soldier's canteen over there right next to his house. and you went in and you paid your Belgian francs, and he gave you a handful of shrapnel balls as part of your bounty for going into the museum. It was kind of packed. It wasn't really a conventional museum as we know them today. It was packed with all kinds of artifacts and detritus and Great War junk. And as you exited the museum, there were big piles of shrapnel casing and all that kind of thing. And you then walked past the big curved bay window of his house. And the first time I walked past it, I didn't notice it. I saw a line of pickelhaubers behind the glass. And when I went back the next time, I noticed that the pickelhaubers were sitting on human skulls. So the helmets were displayed on human skulls that he had found in this wood, excavating the trenches. And he claimed that the trenches that he had were original, but I later discovered that they weren't. And one of the stories he told was about this bunker that we see here. And he claimed that Hitler was wounded here at Bayernwald, at Croonaert Wood, brought into this bunker. And then that night, there was a British trench raid. And the Brits got into the trenches and made their way down this trench towards the bunker. And there was a gas blanket over the door. And a young British officer went up to the door, pulled the gas blanket back, and peeked inside, revolver first. Now, I'm not going to go in there today because it's full of water, but I'll just kind of lower it so you can kind of see inside there. It's pretty dark. He pulled the gas blanket back, pointed his pistol at the wounded Hitler, who was lying on a stretcher, and then paused, was about to pull the trigger, paused and said, "Oh, I won't shoot you. You'll do no harm." And it's a great kind of story, but it's complete bunkum. It never happened. Hitler was not wounded here. He was wounded twice in the Great War, once on the Somme in 1916 by shrapnel, and then later on the Belgian-French border by gas in October of 1918. But this was the kind of stories that often were told in places like this. So a trench system connected with Adolf Hitler, but not a bunker. This is from later on when the Germans fortified their positions along the Messines Ridge. They built a whole series of concrete structures like this one. So we're going to take a little walk through the trench system here. I'm just going to hold that up and keep an eye on my footing as I head down here. It's been a wet couple of days so far, and the kind of wooden boards are a bit slippy, but we're not, at least we don't have shell fire dropping on the trench to make it uber realistic. But up in the trees, can hear the bird song. I caught some blackbirds earlier singing, and blue tit, I think a goldfinch. No skylarks. You don't see quite so many skylarks in Belgium to do the difference in terrain. But I'm just going to pause here because this is also an original feature in the trench here. This is a kind of a dugout. They call it a funk hole in the British position. So this would be part of a shelter that the Germans had in this part of the trench. I'll just come back slightly so you can see that in a kind of wider aspect. And it could have been used for men to shelter in there, but probably more likely was a position where they kept ammunition. So possibly grenades, possibly small arms ammunition, possibly ammunition for their mortars, for their Minenwerfers that were here. And there would have been Minenwerfer positions within these trenches. Now, when they've reconstructed it, they haven't obviously been able to add every single feature. There's no fire steps, for example. That's one thing that is kind of missing in this trench, but it does. And again, walking through it, it kind of gives us a bit of an insight into the troglodyte world of the First World War. And I think as well, when you feel kind of contained and isolated in a trench like this, and essentially it kind of all looks the same, and you can kind of think of that maybe at night. You can see how easy it was to get lost, really, which is why trench boards with trench names on, and your knowledge of those names and that system was really, really important. So there's actually a question about that very thing in the next episode of the podcast. So we're going to turn into another section of the trenches. Just before we do, where we are, so we're in a second line, we just come out of a second line trench, continues off in that way. The actual front line was a bit further just beyond those trees. So these are not front line trenches, they're second line trenches. And we're about to move into the area, getting close to the third line. So this is moving up to what in the British trenches they call the reserve line. But you can see here this kind of traverse. So when they came to reconstructing these trenches properly, Andre Becker's Trench Museum was a complete fabrication. So a group of archaeologists did this, and they basically used the trench maps and the air photos and the plans that were in diaries and things, and they reconstructed the trenches here exactly as they were. So this kind of traverse, this junction in the trenches, was a feature that would have been here more than 100 years ago. And that leads us into another section of the trench here. I'm not going to walk down there, but I think you can see visually these trenches look really, really good. And we're just coming round to what would have led you into the final section of a communication trench that we're in now, that would have taken you to the full extent of that reserve line, which would have been just over there. Now, this is just some steps out of the trench, as you can see just here. So there's nothing more of it there. So, you know, you've got to imagine yourself now as a German soldier moving up to come and get towards the front line area. You're coming down the communication trench up towards the second line position, and then you would have continued onwards to the front line. And there would have been movement in these trenches with men bringing up rations and ammunition and supplies, bringing up the post, bringing up food and drink. Germans like their coffee rather than tea, so there would have been a lot of coffee brought up here. And in the period that Hitler was here, and up to about the time of the Battle of Messines, when this ground was captured by British troops of the 19th Western Division on the 7th of June 1917. Oh, so I've got lost myself there. I need to go down this bit. Then the Germans who occupied it during that period would have had pretty good rations. If the Germans had still been occupation of this in 1918, the ration story would have been very different, because all of the good food and the things that German soldiers had enjoyed was beginning to run out. So this has brought us into another section of the second line position, where we've got another example of a German bunker. I don't think that one's going to pass the health and safety risk assessments kind of use to go inside and spend any kind of time in there, but it gives us an idea about bunker construction. So what we've got here are bunker blocks that the Germans have precast and then brought up to construct these kind of bunkers. And they found actually that this type of construction absorbed the impact of shells better. If you built a solid concrete wall, the concussion of a shell hitting it could often concuss, sometimes fatally concuss, the people inside. But this kind of Lego brick approach to bunker construction was something that worked much, much better. And so you kind of see a second phase of bunkers being built here on the Messines Ridge. I'm just going to come back so you can see that. There we are, a slightly wider shot of it, using this later design that they felt gave the people inside these bunkers a greater chance of survival. And they were used as shelters and as headquarters, and they could also mount a machine gun on the roof for defense and the machine gun could be used for direct fire, an enemy advancing up the slopes of the Messines Ridge from over there, or it could be used for indirect fire to lay down a barrage onto the enemy positions. And in terms of the enemy, when Hitler was there, that story about a British officer sparing his life is doubly bunkum, because Hitler never fought the British here. His unit was up against the French, and it was French soldiers that they were fighting. You might hear a bit of noise in the background because they're doing some ditching work just over there. So we're heading up another bit of this second line trench. Later on, after the front here had remained static for so long, both sides, of course, went underground. That was very common with the battles in Flanders, tunnelling on these parts of the battlefield. It's not just the Royal Engineer tunnelling companies doing it, but also the Germans. And they didn't have specialist tunnelling units. They used pioneers from their own pioneer regiments to do the work. And here at Croonaert, there are a couple of examples of the tunnel entrances to mining galleries. And again, if I've kind of got my geography right, I'm hoping that we're kind of heading into one now. So again, we can kind of see how lack of soldiers living in this wood, of course, they don't live in it anymore, but it contributes to the deterioration of the construction of the trench. And when you think about the experience of soldiers here during the Great War, it was as much fighting as labouring, really, because that was the bulk of their kind of task, was to labour in these trenches more than fight, and just to survive in them, stop them from collapsing, repair damage that had been done by enemy shell fire, and also from the elements. Then it required a lot of men to do a lot of work. Now this trench is narrowing now, and kind of again giving us an insight into that kind of troglodyte nature of the First World War. And we won't spend too long near the biggest amount of noise here, but I do want to try and show you the tunnel entrance, which I'm hoping is at the end of this trench. So bear with me. We're coming to another juncture of trench, and this is only a small area of preserved German line, but it kind of gives you an idea of just how complex these positions were. Okay, this is an end of the trench. Right, I can see the mining gallery. We're going to take a left here from Berliner Strasse into Hamburgstrasse. I actually don't know what the trenches here were called. They're Bavarian, so they probably had München Strasse and Albersalzberg Strasse, or some kind of place in Bavaria that the trenches were named after. But that naming of trenches was an important part of the culture of these trench systems, because it gave them a familiarity. It kind of echoed places from home. And I think that was quite important for the men who were here on both sides of the battlefield during the Great War. So here we are. We have come to a mine shaft. So this is, I won't go in there because some of the planks look a bit rotten. This is a German mine shaft from the First World War. You can see it's water-filled, unsurprisingly, in the wet Flanders plain. And this took you down to a lower level, and then some galleries going off towards the Allied lines. Now, when I came here with my school in the 1980s, there was actually a winch and a bucket seat, metal bucket seat. And we could winch each other down one part of this tunnel system, which again, kind of wouldn't pass the health and safety of the type of people who visit battlefields today, but it certainly was an incredible kind of insight into the experience of this. And Andre Beccard told me that he went down this in 1977 when the level of the water dropped during that very, very hot summer in Europe. And he claimed that there was a German mine charge at the end of the tunnel system. But given that he claimed Hitler was wounded here and all kinds of other things, then who knows, really. But this gives us a bit of an insight into what the Germans were doing on the Messines front, which was tunneling as well. So I'm just going to come away from that, move back away from the area where the noise is. And I'm having to walk a little bit carefully here because some of the boards are a bit springy and they're a bit slippery as well. So again, you kind of think during the Great War, one of the things that's missing here, there would have been telephone wire along these trenches, which also caused a great obstacle to men, particularly in the darkness. So you could be snagging yourself, tripping over stuff, going Pickelhaube over Derriere, in kind of just about everywhere you were walking in a place like this. So the trenches themselves, as well as offering protection, also offered a kind of strange, difficult to navigate kind of world to live in, but also offered their own kind of dangers just to move around them. So we're just going to come back down through this next bit of the second line and then cut into another area up towards the wood and just kind of say a little bit more about this. So Hitler was here in that early phase with the Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment that he was a part of, as part of a Bavarian Reserve Division, occupying this part of the Messines Ridge from when they reached it in the late autumn of 1914. His regiment had fought at Gelleveld. I was at Gelleveld Chateau yesterday, just off the Menin Road, and Hitler's regiment had fought in that area. It's the place where during the centenary it was claimed that Tandy VC, a soldier of the West Riding Regiment, I think, claimed in the Second World War that he'd spared Hitler's life there. It's a story that I don't personally believe, because I don't think Tandy could have possibly known who Hitler was then or recognized him a generation later. But nevertheless, it's a kind of a potent story. So Hitler's regiment had fought at Gelleveld, at the chateau there, and then they moved here and encountered the French. At Gelleveld, they'd been up against the British. They encountered the French, and this was their first phase of trench warfare, constructing trenches like this. Hitler's job was a runner. At this stage, he was a company runner, and he was running to and from company to battalion headquarters, which was a lot nearer the front. And it was during one of those incidents that he said to have saved the life of an officer, which led to the award of the Iron Cross. And that took place on the other side of that wooded area in the autumn of 1914. So Hitler, being a runner, wouldn't have lived in these trenches with the men, with the normal kind of rifle platoons. He would have been back at company command post, which again was probably somewhere over there in the third line area, back towards the nearest village in that direction, which is Witscherte or White Sheet to the British troops. So he wasn't kind of exposed necessarily to the everyday nature of trench warfare and the dangers of trench warfare, but being a runner, it was his job to come up trenches like these and navigate them and bring messages to the company positions here and the individual platoons here on the battlefield. So this bit of communication trench would have taken you up towards the front line trench, which was just the other side of that tree line there, that immediate tree line. So this would have been the way to the front line. And in theory, Hitler at some point came up this trench to deliver a message or take a message back. He then moved from here to Messines itself, and he served directly in front of Messines village, doing the same kind of job, going from the church. Messines is kind of that way down the ridge, can't see it from here. Looking, you can see some buildings in the distance there, possibly. That's down towards where the British front line was, and prior to that, the French front line at the bottom of the Messines Ridge, because the Germans had captured all of the high ground here and dominated it. So they were in kind of total possession of the dominance of the battlefield here. So Hitler moved to that part of the front at Messines, kind of that way, and then other Bavarian units moved in here, and this would pretty much remain a Bavarian Army Corps sector on this stretch of the Messines Ridge up to the period of the big Battle of Messines in June of 1917, when 19 mines were placed under the German positions and blown along that front in the early hours of the 7th of June 1917. Some just up the road, can't see it from here, but we passed just kind of that way, the craters of Hollandsche Schur. Just beyond that is the Grand Bois, Petit Bois. Beyond that, Madelstedt Farm and Peckham craters and Spanbrook Molen. And then in that direction is Saint-Éloi, where the largest mine of the war was exploded on the 7th of June 1917, which was 96,000 pounds of ammonol. And in that battle, no matter how good these trenches were, no matter what kind of field of fire the Germans had, the British in that battle were able to lay down enough of a barrage, take out key targets with the mines, but more importantly, use artillery to enable their men to advance up those slopes into trenches like this and take them. And I'm off the top of my head, I think it was the 9th Battalion of the Cheshire Regiment that came through here during that advance. So they were the ones that captured this ground. And then it was in British hands from June 1917. There's a cemetery just over there called Croonaert Chapel on the reverse slope of the Messines Ridge, where there's gunners' burials when the guns moved off to set up new gun batteries near here. There's a Chinese Labour Corps soldier buried in there. He was killed clearing the battlefields after the war. And this remained in British hands then until April of 1918, when the Germans attacked from that direction and retook this ground and pushed the British much, much further back that way, in some cases across the French border towards and through the town of Bayerneald, making this huge indent into the British line. And then eventually in September 1918, an Allied counterattack pushed the Germans back in the final battles of Ypres. And amongst the units who fought in this area were the 27th New York and the 30th Tennessee divisions of the American Expeditionary Force attached to the British. They fought just kind of over there. And there is a memorial to them on the road from Kemmel to Ypres, kind of roughly in that direction. So it's a battlefield that saw a lot of combat during the Great War and saw a lot of fighting and all kinds of warfare, from the kind of open warfare of 1914 when the French and the Germans first clashed here, some of the first trench warfare, the kind of development of trench warfare, the kind of thing that we see represented in these reconstructed trenches, and then saw long periods of static warfare where there was no big battles and men on both sides would be killed and wounded kind of every single day that they were in positions like this. The kind of, the British called it daily wastage on their side, where men were being killed and wounded every single day just by holding the line. And certainly when you kind of look at the records of the British side of things, there were men who would have come to the trenches opposite these who possibly even didn't get a chance to fire their weapon before they were killed or wounded, because there was virtually no opportunity to do that in the static nature of trench warfare. And that's something I think we kind of perhaps surprises us. And the other thing I think about the nature when you think of trenches like this, Static warfare can also mean boredom. And there were men who would have been bored in these trenches. And boredom is something that we would not associate with the experience of the First World War. But there would have been boredom because there wasn't really a lot of activity going on. And you were doing kind of monotonous tasks of maintenance and repair, and the daily tasks that were kind of required to keep units in the ground. There's another mine shaft through here, which we'll just go and have a quick look at. But that led to a lot of men developing kind of methodology, coping mechanisms to deal with that boredom, which could be anything from playing innocent games through to gambling. But also, of course, doing things like writing home and reading letters from home, and all that became very, very important indeed. And while we know less about the German postal system of the First World War compared to the British, you may remember we did a bit about letters to Tommy and how letters could come from Britain and almost be on the front line within 24 hours of being posted. I think from what I've read in the German archives in places like Württemberg, it was a similar thing here. So, you know, a family of a soldier here in Munich, could write a letter in the morning, and certainly by at least the next morning, their son was reading it in these trenches here, and it would be brought by rail to Belgium, and then possibly by lorry to depots near the front line, and then distributed by the German army to the men in the front line. So that kind of infrastructure, even of just posts, was a really important part of the experience of trench warfare. So we're coming to another sap here. So this is a trench that's come out from the main trench and has brought us to this sap head, where there is another mining shaft there down into the tunnel system that was here. And one of the things that, again, Simon Verdigam discovered when he excavated Messines was just how prevalent the tunnelers were. He found a lot of tunneling gear in some of the places, and when in that area the German tunnelers broke into the British tunnels, and the tunnels were flooded, and that brought mining in that area to an end, they used their methodology, tools, equipment, and their tunnel props to build a shallow tunnel system to be able to move machine guns unseen by the British from one position to another. So, you know, all of this kind of infrastructure, equipment, and the units that were here, all of this was put into good use and was all part of the day-to-day experience of trench warfare. And I think the value of coming to a place like this is it gives us that kind of tactile experience of being in a trench ourselves, seeing kind of how compact it is, how you can kind of bop down, and here you are on the bottom of the trench, and then you're knowing during the war that the enemy is just over there. It kind of gives us a bit of a insight into it in a way that I think books can't always do, or not even podcasts, that we can kind of describe the experience of this, but to come here and see it and touch it is also something else. And one of the things that I remember about going down the mine shaft as a young student in the 1980s was the smell of it as well, that really strong smell of blue clay, which is the clay beneath this surface area here in Flanders. And a smell that I didn't experience again until I went down the dugouts at Bozinger with the diggers in the early 2000s, when the blue clay kind of got everywhere, got all over what we were doing, and very much kind of stayed under our fingertips and in our ears, in our nostrils. That's kind of a top shot, if you like, of the trenches there, to give you a bit of an idea of the zigzag shape. And that zigzag shape was to minimize the effect of shell blasts, to stop. If a shell dropped in a straight trench, everyone could be killed and wounded. But if it was in a zigzag trench, it would only kill people in one section of it. I'm just going to move up into the shelter that we can see here, because it's quite a nice bronze model. And then what we'll do, we'll probably pause for some questions. There's a map showing the other Great War sites in this area, from the memorial to the 16th Irish Division who took Whitshelter alongside the Ulster Division, to the Irish Peace Tower. The American Memorial was on there, and the display at Messines of artifacts, the Lettenberg bunkers that are dressing station bunkers near Kemmel Hill, and so much more besides. And one of the craters there, the Pool of Peace. But we're going to come around the corner, and we've got this huge bronze model of the Messines battlefield, and it's probably going to be difficult to convey this via the medium of a live broadcast, but we'll give it a go. Let's come down to where we are. So this is Bayernwald, just here. This is Bayernwald. Here is the village of Whitshelter, right on the top of the Messines Ridge, if we kind of come up. And in front of it is the Petit Bois and the Grand Bois. There's Hollandse Farm, and they've indicated mine craters on here by these kind of circular indents. So that was a triple blast at Hollandse Farm. That's Croonaert Chapel Cemetery just there. And where we are is just in this bit of the wood here, in that second line position, with the German front line being here, and the French and then the British front line being here. And in the distance, that village is Vormezele. That's St. Eloi, just over here, just to the south of Ypres, and Ypres is just off the top of the map. And when we kind of follow the front line from the big mine at St. Eloi, that £96,000 charge, we can follow the traces of the trenches past Croonaert Wood, past Hollandse Farm, the Petit Bois craters that we can see here, and then down to Peckham, Madelstead Farm, and there's Spanbroek-Molen. That's in the sector where the Ulster Division went over the top. 16th Irish Division were attacking here, including Willie Redmond MP, who was killed that day, Irish nationalist MP who went forward as a much older man, but serving as an infantry officer on the battlefield. Spanbroek-Molen, the Croonaert craters, and Ontario Farm. And I don't know if you can see it on here, but that's a kind of a disc rather than an indent, because Ontario Farm was a curious one. When the mine went off there, it was so deep that it funneled up superheated blue clay, and it was likened to stew or soup in a pan on the fire, bubbling away. So there was no crater here. The ground just bubbled for a while following the actual explosion. When you go there today, it's just rough ground. And then where there should have been a mine was here at the Petit Douve farm. And this is the one that was discovered in 1916 and flooded and abandoned. The charge is still there underneath the farm buildings. And this bit of ground here is where Simon Verdigam did a lot of his archaeology in 2012 that we filmed for a program. And that then brings us down to the southern part of the battlefield. There's Croonaert Wood there, and the front lines here. There was 3 mines blown here, Trench 122, and these at Factory Farm. And they were going to blow these ones at the Birdcage just east of Plug Street Wood, but Monash, who commanded the 3rd Australian Division in this area, didn't want them, didn't need them, so they were not used, and they are still there, although this one went off in 1955. So here and up at Petit Douve and Messines, we have some of the largest World War I UXBs, unexploded charges from the Great War. So I'm just going to put the camera down on its tripod. And you may remember when we did this from Ypres, it's quite hard for me to see questions, but I hope that kind of little walk around the trenches little bit about the experience of trench warfare and the fighting here at Messines via this plan. It's kind of made sense and has been of interest, and something a bit different for us to broadcast live from a very battlefield location, very much part of the old front line. I think it's quite important for us to do that now and again. So I'm just going to click on the chat, which the image might just go slightly the other way. I'm just going to kind of look at the question. So if you've got a question that you'd like me to answer, I'll wrap it up here for the recording side of things. So thanks for those who watch live and those who are watching it later. This is where it'll end. I might continue depending on kind of how long this goes on, but anyway, we'll answer some of these questions. So if anyone's got any questions about what we've just kind of looked at, or anything you want to say, then fire away in the questions bit, rather than unmute yourself and talk, because I'm not sure I've allowed you to unmute yourself because of the nature of this recording. So anyway, if you've got any questions, pop them in that group chat and let me know. But what I'll do, I'll just come out of that for a minute. Oh, here we go. Sorry, there was one there. Do you still need to get a code to enter the trench area from Chemical Information Office? That's a very good question. So at the, show me what I'm showing you now. So at the gate there, you can see there's a turnstile entrance. No one mans this site, it's unmanned. So what you do is you can go to Camel Tourist Office to get a ticket, or you can do what I did, which is I went online and I booked it online, and you get sent a PDF digital ticket with a little barcode, which you scan at the entrance, and it lets you in, and it costs €5, which I think, for being given access to a trench system like this, that is really incredibly good value, and I would thoroughly recommend it. And all the money goes back into the restoration of this site. The panels that we've got here are kind of info panels. There's a bit of an air photo here showing where we are. So this kind of blue outline is the wood where we are. We're here. So we're on the edge of the wood today. It's a slightly different shape today. It's more straight this way. This bit of the wood isn't there. That's the actual German front line. And we've been exploring these second line positions over here, basically. So there's another question popped up. When Andrew Becker excavated the site and ran his museum there, did you take the bucket seat ride down the mine shaft? If so, can you recount your experience? Yes, I did. And that was where, I think, as I was saying, where I kind of not just got the experience of the trenches, I also got the smell of the First World War by doing that. Something I'm sure that would drive teachers in the modern world absolutely potty, the thought of children going down an unsupported bucket seat into a mine shaft of unknown depth. But it was quite incredible, really, to be able to do that. Excellent to get to see the battlefields, German trenches close up and live too. The duck boards are different to the British ones, not as good. Well, that's an interesting point, actually. Were they as good because they were kind of flat timber rather than like kind of lattice kind of support? Certainly, one of the things I think is the real great value of battlefield archaeology, and that's something that work with people like Simon Verdigan proves, is that we can read accounts, we can look at war diaries, we can look at trench manuals and engineering manuals, but then you see how they adapted the whole construction of trenches according to terrain. And what was clear, I think, from the really intricate nature of German trench construction at Messines, which is the same kind of system that was built here, is that it does seem to have worked. And all the photographs that we found of their trenches didn't show them as flooded, perhaps, as the British ones. And I've just noticed that they've got a couple of pictures of the German trenches on the wall here. So I'm just going to walk us over there and we'll have a look at those. So I'm not sure which was better, but I'm not sure that the German system was that safe, really, to walk around. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but that's kind of a close-up of one of the, this was taken in Bayernwald in, I think, 1915, something like that. And it shows the trench there. You can see they're not in a frontline trench because this this fella here, he's standing right up looking over the parapet, which is not a wise thing to do in any trench. But if you look down onto the floor, you can see the style of floorboards, trench boards that we saw in the reconstructed trench in the wood itself. So they really kind of spared nothing, really. I mean, what you do see here are the firing steps, which are not in the reconstructed trench. But, you know, you still have to have a battalion of people living in this wood to kind of keep it in any kind of First World War state. I'm sure probably some of us might volunteer to do that. Was the wattling ever daubed to maintain the strength? Now, that's a good question. I've seen images where they seem to have daubed it, but I don't think that that was that common. I think that they fixed them quite frequently in sections to the trench side, and they kept spare reconstructed parts of it and then brought those in as to when the previous ones were damaged. And it was much easier to remove a damaged, non-daubed wall as it was compared to one that wasn't daubed, that was daubed rather. So if it was daubed, it would be a hell of a job to take that off and replace it. Whereas if it was just the timber, then you could just replace that with an entire new section, which is kind of what they did. Hi, Elizabeth. Oh, I missed the salient in early spring. Yeah, it's pretty cold though today. It was nice this morning up at Tyncott, but it's been pretty cold now, and there's a storm on the way. You can probably hear someone shouting in the background. I'm not sure what that's about. With the Germans mostly occupying the high ground, easier for them to drain their trenches. Well, that's an interesting point, because I remember Peter Doyle, who's a great friend of the podcast who we've had on many times, saying that actually being on top of the hill was no better because of the nature of how the blue clay worked. It would still push the water up to the surface level, even on high ground. And that when the Germans dug down on the top of a ridge, their trenches had the same kind of problem with the water as the British down in the positions beneath it. Paul, what was the width of the front which was achieved in the 1917 assault? And were there any points which became difficult? Well, actually, it was such a well-planned battle, and we've kind of, you know, it's difficult to see on this model, but that's the kind of overview of it. So the attack went in from just north of this map. That's the Comines Canal there, the bluff, the area of the bluff. So the attack went in, hang on, sorry, the phone has come loose. The attack went in from the area around Hill 60 and Caterpillar, and then continued down past the bluff to Saint-Loire, the area where we are now around Witcharter, and then down towards Messines and beyond that Plug Street. So that was a front of about a dozen miles, something like that. And there weren't really any areas that were sticky as such because of the amount of artillery that was used to pummel the German positions, the creeping barrages that were laid, the reactive artillery fire that enabled the infantry to call back fire and take out strong points, and the whole kind of battle plan, and the men who were briefed. Every single soldier was briefed on every aspect of the battle. They constructed models of the Messines battlefield like this a little bit, but on a bigger scale that soldiers were then taken to, and were then instructed on what their purpose was, what their battalion was doing, what their brigade was doing, what the division was doing, and what the units on their flanks were doing as well. And this was something that Daddy Plumer, General Plumer, really kind of felt was really important. And it changed the philosophy of the BEF in that this was a turning point in the war in which soldiers were beginning to be told a lot more. The Canadians had done it at Vimy Ridge in April 1917. Some British units had done it as well. But this, in terms of an overall, not just a corps or a division, this was an army that was attacking here. And the whole army plan was about giving soldiers as much information as you could to make them prepared for battle. So that was really important. Some of those reconstructions looked a bit broken. Yeah, they are not in tip-top condition, I suspect. It's been a very wet winter, and that's had a big effect on the trenches. So they need to get some Great War soldiers back in to to repair that. The blue clay is a pig to dig here in Somerset. Oh, yes, most certainly, absolutely. It certainly was had a great effect on the battlefields here. Is there any connection between these trenches and the reconstructed German trenches at the Passchendaele Memorial Museum at Zonnebeek? Yeah, so some of the people involved at Zonnebeek with the construction of their trenches there, which again are part of a museum, an excellent museum, well worth going to, were involved in the construction of these. And again, they use the same kind of methodology and approach, tools, using, it's kind of called experimental archaeology, I guess, where they're using the methodology of the past to construct an image of the past with something that we can see on a modern landscape. And so those people were involved in this, and they went on to then build that trench system at Zonnebeek as well. So that covers early war German trenches, later war German trenches, and then also a big section of a typical British front line in 1916 with fire bays, latticed kind of duck boards on inverted A-frame supports and things like that. So yeah, an interesting kind of look into it. So we've been going for a little while. It's about 3/4 of an hour or so. I hope that's been of interest, and I hope broadcasting live has kind of given us a kind of slightly different angle to the Great War. And hang on a minute. And oh, here we are. You can see me. I got my commando hat on. So I hope that's been of interest, and something that I certainly will be looking to repeat as the weather gets better. It's much more difficult in the winter months because I've got to broadcast this time of day. But as we move towards better weather, longer days, warmer nights, we can only but dream. I hope to be broadcasting to you again on the battlefields once more. So thank you all for joining. Thank you all for listening in. I hope it's been an interesting afternoon. Thanks to those of you who watch this on catch up as well. So thanks for doing that. And until we meet again, and I'll see you all once more next month. See you on another occasion on the old front line. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.